All right, ready to dive in. Today, we're heading over to Ghana to untangle their tenancy laws.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. Whether you're a landlord, a tenant, or just fascinated by different legal systems, this deep dive is going to be packed with insights.
Ghana is known for being pretty tenant-friendly, right?
Exactly. They've got a system that really tries to balance the scales between landlords and tenants.
So if I'm thinking about, I don't know, maybe moving to Ghana, what's the first thing I should know about renting there?
Well, first off, forget those crazy stories about landlords demanding a year's worth of rent upfront.
Oh, yeah, I've heard those.
In Ghana, that's a big no-no. The law actually sets a clear limit.
Okay, so what's the maximum a landlord can ask for?
6 months is the absolute most they can request in advance.
6 months.
And that's only for long tenancies. If it's a shorter rental agreement, it's capped even lower at just 2 months.
Wow, that's a pretty big difference from what I'm used to hearing.
Right. It's one of the ways Ghana protects tenants from those hefty upfront costs.
Makes sense. So what else? What other kind of protections do tenants have?
Well, here's something that might really surprise you. In Ghana, you can actually get compensated for improvements you make to a rental property.
Really?
Yeah. Let's say you decide to upgrade the kitchen, or maybe you do some landscaping to make the outdoor space nicer.
Okay, I'm following.
If you happen to be evicted for a certain period of time, the landlord might actually owe you money for those upgrades.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So they're actually recognizing the tenant's contribution to the property.
Exactly. It shows that Ghana values the tenant's role in maintaining and even enhancing the rental space.
So Ghana seems to have a lot of safeguards in place for renters. What about for landlords? Like, how do they protect their interests?
That's where the tenancy agreement comes in. This is a super important document for both tenants and landlords.
So what exactly is a tenancy agreement?
It's basically like a contract, your rule book, for the entire rental period. It lays out all the essential details, things like the rent amount, who's responsible for repairs, all the nitty-gritty.
So it's like a way to avoid those he said, she said situations.
Exactly. Having everything in writing, signed and dated, prevents misunderstandings and disputes down the line.
Makes sense. You definitely don't want to rely on memory when it comes to something as important as housing.
Absolutely. Speaking of potential disputes, let's talk about rent increases. One thing that often worries tenants is whether a landlord can just suddenly hike up the rent whenever they feel like it.
Oh yeah, that's a big concern for renters everywhere. So how does Ghana handle that?
Well, they have a system to prevent those kinds of unfair rent spikes.
Okay, good. So the landlord can't just raise the rent on a whim.
Nope. Only the rent control department, a specific government body, has the power to determine if a rent increase is justified.
And by how much, too, I'd imagine.
You got it. So it's not just a free-for-all when it comes to rent increases. Everything is regulated and controlled.
Wow, that sounds a lot more reassuring for tenants, knowing they're protected from sudden, unreasonable increases.
Absolutely. It's all about creating a fair and predictable rental environment.
So we've talked about rent increases. Are there any regulations around evictions?
Absolutely. In Ghana, evictions are a pretty serious matter, and they're governed by very specific rules.
So a landlord can't just kick someone out for any reason?
No, not at all. There has to be a valid reason, like consistently not paying rent or maybe serious violations of the tenancy agreement.
Okay, so there are legitimate grounds for eviction. But what about the process? Can a landlord just, change the locks and force someone out?
Definitely not. Even if there's a valid reason, landlords can't just take matters into their own hands. They have to follow a proper legal process.
Meaning going through the courts and everything.
Exactly. It ensures that evictions are handled fairly and legally, and that tenants have a chance to defend themselves if needed.
That makes sense. So both sides have to play by the rules.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's really important for tenants. The right to privacy.
Privacy. Okay, so how does that work in a rental situation?
Well, in Ghana, landlords can't just barge into the property whenever they please. They have to give the tenant reasonable notice before entering.
Okay, so there are boundaries.
Absolutely. Except for emergency situations, of course.
Like a burst pipe or something.
Exactly. But in general, tenants have the right to enjoy their homes without feeling like they're constantly being monitored.
Right, everyone needs the personal space. Makes sense.
And on that note, tenants in Ghana are also protected from something called retaliatory actions by landlords.
Retaliatory actions, what does that mean?
Well, let's say a tenant reports a safety issue to the rent control department. Maybe something like faulty wiring or a broken smoke detector.
Okay, I see.
The landlord can't then turn around and try to evict them out of spite.
Oh, wow. So they can't punish the tenant for speaking up?
Exactly. That would be considered retaliatory, and it's against the law.
That's good to know. It really shows that Ghana takes tenant rights seriously.
Definitely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From rent limits to evictions, we've touched on some of the key aspects of Ghana's tenancy laws.
It's fascinating how much thought and care has gone into creating this system.
Right. It's really all about striking a balance between the rights and responsibilities of both tenants and landlords.
Well said. And it sounds like they've done a pretty good job of it.
They have, but we've only just scratched the surface.
Mhm.
There's a lot more to explore when it comes to renting in Ghana.
Really? Okay, well, I'm ready to keep diving in. What else is there to unpack?
Well, next we're going to delve into those everyday situations that pop up when you're renting. Those things that aren't always covered in the law books.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Sounds like we're getting into the real life stuff.
Exactly. Stay tuned. Okay, so we've covered the big picture stuff, rent limits, evictions, tenant rights. But what about those everyday situations, the kind of things that come up when you're actually renting?
Yeah, I mean, laws are great, but real life can throw you some curveballs.
Exactly. So let's say, hypothetically, you're renting a place,
Right.
and suddenly the bathroom faucet starts leaking like crazy.
Oh, no.
You call the landlord, but they're not exactly rushing to get it fixed. What do you do?
Ugh, that's a nightmare. You're stuck with a flooded bathroom even though it's their property.
Exactly. It's one of those classic renter dilemmas. But luckily, in Ghana, the law is pretty clear on this.
Oh, good. So what does it say?
As a tenant, you have a right to what's called peaceful enjoyment of the property.
Peaceful enjoyment. That sounds nice.
It is. Basically, it means the landlord can't just ignore essential repairs. They have a responsibility to keep the place habitable.
Okay, so the landlord is obligated to fix the leaky faucet. But what's the first step? Should I start calling plumbers myself?
Hold on. Before you go all DIY, make sure you've documented everything.
Documentation. Like what?
Take photos of the leak, write down every conversation you have with the landlord about it, dates, times, the whole shebang.
Seems like a bit of a hassle. Why is it so important?
Trust me, if things escalate and you need to get the rent control department involved, having solid proof is absolutely essential.
So it's all about having evidence if you need to make a case.
Exactly. It protects you in the long run.
Okay, so I've got my evidence. What's next? Do I, storm the landlord's office?
Whoa there. Hold your horses. Always try to resolve things amicably first.
Right, keep it civil.
Exactly. Send a written notice to the landlord, outlining the problem, and requesting repairs within a reasonable time frame.
Okay, makes sense. So a formal written request. And what's a reasonable time frame for something like a major leak?
I'd say 24 to 48 hours, something like that, for anything urgent.
Okay, that sounds fair. But what if, even after all that, the landlord still doesn't budge?
Well, then it's time to bring in the big guns.
Ooh, the big guns. Who are we talking about?
The rent control department.
Ah, okay, the folks who oversee everything.
Yep. They have the authority to step in, investigate the situation, and hopefully mediate a solution.
So they're like a renter's best friend.
You could say that.
Yeah.
They're there to make sure the law is being followed and that both sides are playing fair.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about tenant rights. What about landlords? What happens if a tenant suddenly stops paying rent?
Oh, yeah, that's rough, and it definitely happens. But just like tenants have protections, landlords have recourse too.
So what's a landlord's first move in that situation? Can they just, call the eviction squad?
Definitely not. First and foremost, communication is key. Reach out to the tenant. Try to understand what's going on.
So try to talk it out first.
Yep. There might be a legitimate reason for the non-payment pain. A job loss, a family emergency, something like that.
Right, so have a little compassion, even when rent's involved.
Exactly. If you can have a conversation and work out a payment plan, that's the ideal scenario.
Makes sense. But what if the tenant's just dodging rent? No explanation, total radio silence.
Well, then things get a little more serious. And the landlord might need to start thinking about eviction proceedings.
But even then, they can't just change the locks and call it a day.
Nope, not at all. Even in cases of non-payment, there's a very specific legal process that has to be followed. It all goes through the courts with formal notices and everything.
So it's not a quick or easy process for either side.
Exactly. It's designed to be fair and thorough, and it protects both parties even when things get messy.
Makes sense. No one gets to act on a whim.
Right. But I gotta be honest, this is all making me a little nervous about renting.
Come on, don't stress. Knowledge is power, right?
True, true.
The more you understand the laws and procedures, the better prepared you'll be. And luckily, there are tons of resources out there to help you navigate it all.
Okay, besides this awesome deep dive, of course.
Well, the Rent Control Department is a gold mine of information. They offer free advice, they can help mediate disputes, all sorts of
So
things.
they're not just about cracking down on rule breakers.
Nope, they genuinely want to help people understand their rights and responsibilities. And they've got a website and a hotline, which is super convenient.
Perfect. And what about actual legal help? Like if things get really complicated.
There are a bunch of legal aid organizations in Ghana that offer free or low-cost legal services, so you don't have to go it alone if you can't afford a private lawyer.
That's great. And I bet there are tons of online resources too.
Oh yeah, tons. Websites, forums, blogs. Just be sure to double-check anything you find online with a reliable source, like the Rent Control Department itself.
Good point. You don't want to be taking legal advice from some random internet commenter.
Exactly. So, to sum it all up, navigating Ghana's rental scene doesn't have to be a nightmare. With a little preparation, open communication, and maybe a dash of legal savvy, you can make it work.
I love that. Well said. Okay, so I think we've covered most of the key points, right?
We have. We've really gotten into the nitty-gritty of renting in Ghana. But before we wrap up this Ghanaian adventure, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the parting wisdom?
Think about this. Ghana's Rent Act has been around since 1963.
Wow, that's like ancient in legal terms.
Right. It's done a good job, but the world has changed a lot since the 60s. Maybe it's time for some updates, don't you think?
Ooh, I like that. That's a great point. What kind of updates would be helpful?
Well, that's something I'd love for our listeners to ponder. What new challenges are renters and landlords facing today? What parts of the law could be clarified or modernized?
That's a great question to leave everyone with. It's a reminder that laws, like everything else, need to evolve to stay relevant.
Exactly. So consider this your homework assignment. Think about how Ghana's tenancy laws could be improved for the 21st century.
Challenge accepted. And thanks to you, I feel a lot more equipped to tackle that assignment.
My pleasure. It's been a fun deep dive.
So we've talked about all these laws, procedures, resources, but what does it actually look like in real life?
Yeah, sometimes you need to, see how it all plays out, right? Get a feel for it.
Absolutely. So let's try a little scenario. Let's say our friend Kofi is renting a nice apartment, and he's put a lot of work into making it his own.
Okay, Kofi's fixing it up.
Yeah, he's repainted, added some shelves, maybe even spruced up the balcony a bit, making it homey.
I like Kofi already.
Me too. But here's the twist. Out of the blue, his landlord tells him he has to move out.
Oh, no, poor Kofi. But wait, he can't just be forced out, right?
That's right. Remember, even if a landlord wants the property back, they can't just evict a tenant without a valid reason.
And going through the courts, all that.
Exactly. It's a process, which is good for Kofi in this case. But here's where things get interesting. Because Kofi made those improvements to the apartment, he might actually be entitled to some compensation.
Hold on, are you serious? He could actually get paid for, like, painting and putting up shelves.
Yep. Ghanaian law recognizes that tenants sometimes invest in their living spaces, and it tries to be fair about it. If Kofi gets evicted before a certain period, and the landlord benefits from those upgrades, well, Kofi deserves something back.
Wow, that's incredible. It really encourages tenants to take care of their rentals, knowing their efforts won't just disappear.
Absolutely. Okay, let's flip the script now. Imagine Abina is a landlord,
Okay, Abina the landlord.
and her tenant is basically vanished. Stopped paying rent, no communication, just ghosted.
Oof, that's a landlord's worst nightmare. What does Abina do? Can't she, just break in?
Tempting, but no. It's important to remember due process is a big deal in Ghana. Abina's first step is to document everything.
Document, like what kind of stuff?
Any missed rent payments, all her attempts to contact the tenant, any evidence she can gather that they've actually moved out, that kind of thing.
So even when it feels like the tenant's gone rogue, it's still important to build that paper trail.
Exactly. Then she needs to follow the official eviction process through the courts. No shortcuts.
Okay, that's good to know. It keeps landlords from just, taking drastic measures without a good reason. It's all about accountability on both sides.
Well said. I think these little scenarios really paint a picture, don't they?
Yeah.
Ghana's tenancy laws aren't just, theoretical. They actually guide real-life situations.
Yeah, they do. And like we've seen, knowing your rights and those procedures, it's crucial no matter which side you're on.
So if we had to boil it all down, what's the one big takeaway for our listeners today?
I'd say it's this renting in Ghana. It has its own, unique aspects, but overall, it's a system designed to be fair.
Fairness, yeah. I like that.
So whether you're dreaming of, I don't know, beachfront living or a cool city apartment in Ghana, just go in informed, communicate openly and clearly, and remember, the law is there to protect you.
That's great advice. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive through Ghanaian tenancy laws. We hope you learned something new, maybe even got inspired to think about renting a bit differently. Until next time.